გავდივ არგზებზე ველოდები next station სვებაზრები ქუჩის მითხრა ey როდის გაქვს start-ation სკორპიო ხარო ავში ბრას უცრავი ცხელ ავში მერე წვიმასავით cash დავში ლინგო მარდი მაგ ვარ ბავში ხიკების გარეშე თამაში ხიკები გარიე ამბავში ვიარე ამბარიდან იმბაში აშლის ძილები მცესეკდაშ ჩემ unicorn თებს რომ გაშიც ქსაში რამდენ იარას წაში რაში დეს რომ ვეძებდი მაში ტაშიო იარე რამდენ კარში რამდენ კარში რომელი ხარში სამყაროს სოდები რამდენი ხარში სარკიდან მიყურებს რომელი სახი
ამ კარში ტურბო მანა დაბზარები ფარში ვისკორკები და დენი ალმაში მანგა გოგო არ ყვავილი თმაში ან დასაკ ან ტყევის ხავში მახეტი ელე ყვალგან სახლში სოლებიანი ბენგოლდენ გარდენი ვიდუარე მენტალს დენტალ ვინტებია და მენტალ ღებ გავაკ თეთ აიფონ ტამ ტამ ჩემ გენ გენ აი ჰაიკო თაბზე ტურბან წერრი მაიკა ვოქუჩეშ გაქცევი ლაიკა
Diane Koenker, welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. Thank you for joining us today. Why don't you introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
I'm an historian of the Soviet Union and of Russia, the Russian Empire. I'm recently retired from University College London, where I was director of the School of Slavonic and East European Studies for the last 5 years. And before that, I was a professor of history at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
Great. And the reason we invited you on today is because for a long time, Sopo and I have wanted to do a podcast episode about vacations, sanatoria, and spa in the Soviet Union. And so in 2013, you wrote a book called Club Red, Vacation Travel and the Soviet Dream. So could you just tell us, like, what got you interested in studying and writing about vacations in the Soviet Union? And how did you come to write this book, Club Red?
Well, I started out my academic career as a labor historian, and my first book was on the 1917 revolution and the role of Moscow workers. And then I was curious, having discovered that or concluded that there was kind of a developing sense of class identity and class consciousness among workers. I wanted to see what happened once socialism arrived. So my next project was on studying Russian printers, Soviet printers in the 1920s as a very kind of articulate and self-conscious, literate group of workers. And I noticed in doing that research that there was something called the Society of Proletarian Tourism that had been created in 1927. So I kind of put that aside. Having finished that book, I wanted to do something more on everyday life in the Soviet Union. And I wanted to do something that was going to span the whole 80 years of the Soviet experiment from 1917 to the 1980s. And my idea was to do a kind of synthetic study of everyday life. And I planned articles on shopping and on housing and romance. And one chapter was going to be on tourism, because I had remembered this Society of Proletarian Tourism. And when I started to do research for the project, I decided I would start with that chapter. And I discovered that the material was so rich, so fascinating, and so understudied that I set aside everything else and decided to do the book just on tourism. And then I discovered that actually tourism was a very small part of vacationing, and actually the health system was a much bigger part of that. So it expanded to sanatoria and rest homes and health spas.
This is my favorite topic in the whole world. So I'm very excited to have you on. So one of the things that's really, a lot of people in Georgia know this, not only do they miss like vacations and retreats and resorts and so on, but we have this like, gorgeous town, Altuvo, and also other areas where these beautiful sanatoriums are just decaying, just falling apart. Or there's like one or two that have been rehabilitated that are now like really expensive and no one can afford. So this, this grandeur is also like they're palaces, like really beautiful buildings for the workers. So it's very, impressive when you see it and you start to realize that like workers had access to these incredible places. And not just like 2 or 3 days, but like a month long, or something very kind of long vacations. There's even a train stop in Zaltbourg where all the workers would come from all over Soviet Union to rest there. And so this is, for me, this is the starting point of why I became interested in the whole resort. And also because I was also studying privatization of healthcare in Georgia and what healthcare looked like. And one of the constant criticisms that sort of neoliberalism was making towards healthcare was that there was too many spaces, like too many institutions, and people were in hospitals for too long for them. It's like for them, it's like you get in, you get your whatever surgery, and then you get out. And so this accent on bed rest and having someone take care of you while you recuperate, this is sort of a different way of thinking that I try to explain to people. This wasn't just like they were just keeping you in the hospital for no reason, but it was also because this idea behind it of how you should rest and recover and be free from all the domestic responsibilities and so on and so on. So maybe you can start speaking about like that, but also I'm also very curious about how the idea of leisure and of rest and vacation sort of changed over time and the debates behind it. You could maybe start anywhere from that.
Yeah, a big set of questions. And, I think that the Soviet Union built on a kind of pre-revolutionary leisure culture, which was exclusively aristocratic. And that the health spas such as mineral waters in the North Caucasus and in Crimea were developed originally to cure soldiers and help military men recover. And when the Soviet Union took over these places, they took over in 1922. They wanted to take all this apparatus and this idea and use it for the benefit of workers, of ordinary people. So one of the first things they did was decree that 1922, there was a right, everybody had a right to a 2-week paid vacation in the Soviet Union. And that was the first such vacation legislation anywhere in the world at that time. They also wanted to take over all these imperial period health facilities and use them for the benefit of the workers. So they moved right into this kind of medicalized sense of leisure. And there was also a very strong sense at this time in the 1920s that leisure for its own sake, for pleasure, was a bad thing. And that these kinds of facilities were what they called repair shops for the human motor, that their purpose was to get workers to recover their health and to get back to work stronger than ever before. So it was very, very purposeful, very utilitarian on the one hand. And it was focused entirely on medical rest, and everything had to have a therapeutic value. The other side of this, it developed over time into less purposeful, less medical, and more leisure and more fun. But the other side of this, my sense is that when the Soviet Union took over the health system and the apparatus, what they took over was this very aristocratic level of service, palaces for workers. And so they really believed that the workers deserve marble dining rooms and Kalnland verandas and all this high level of facility, which was in fact very expensive. And yet they preserved this kind of highly labor intensive, highly capital intensive method of recuperation during the entire period. And in the 1950s and 60s, when Soviet doctors and health resort people began to meet with their counterparts in socialist Eastern Europe, the Eastern Europeans were shocked at how expensive Soviet healthcare was. They had much more modest facilities. So that's a plus in that the regime wanted workers to become like aristocrats. But as the neoliberals say, it was also very expensive, and it meant that the facilities couldn't be accessed by as many people as they might otherwise have been if they'd been more affordable. And the other thing is that you mentioned that, these were for workers, and workers could come to these wonderful palatial health resorts and spend all the time they needed to get health care and recover from operations or recover from tuberculosis, or just there was something called climate therapy that was just to get out in fresh air and recover from the pollution of the cities. These places quickly became taken over by the elites rather than the workers. There was a law that 80% of rest home patients, and they were called patients, and sanatorium patients should be workers, even though the workers were 20% of the population, so a hugely disproportionate number. But when you look at actually who came, and I went through pages and pages of flimsy records in the 1930s of the kind of patients there were, they were overwhelmingly educated party members. And if the workers got to go to these places, it was in the winter rather than the summer. So they were being turned into not places of health, but places of recreation and leisure. But they still had the huge health apparatus. So they were run by medical doctors. You had to get a pass there through a medical doctor, but if you could fix that easily enough. So on, structurally it was medicalized, but it became corrupted and became a source of pleasure and privilege in a way throughout.
So when did it become for workers? Because workers did go and they did have access, but when did it become more available for everyone, let's say?
Well, it never really became available to agricultural workers. They were never allowed these vouchers to health resorts until I think the late 1960s and 1970s. They were, certain workers in very hazardous occupations were especially targeted, and trade unions of the coal mine workers and the railway workers would have their own sanatoria. A lot of the grand ones in Sochi that are now falling apart were built by those trade unions, and the ones that were designated for trade unions tended more to be workers, but it was still more the officials as much as the rank and file workers. Workers weren't always comfortable going to these places, and because they were away from their families for a whole month, and they were kind of on their own and sometimes out of their depth. I watched a lot of propaganda films about this, and they always emphasized here at the same table we have a railway worker, and we have an engineer and a physicist and a writer, and then all walks of life come together. But the statistics suggest that it was somewhat more segregated than that. People wanted more than just medicalized leisure, and that's how the tourism movement got started, which was kind of parallel to the health spas. And that even better for workers was active rest. So young workers especially were encouraged to learn tourist skills, and this is kind of like adventure tourism, hiking, cycling, boating, and they were encouraged to form these voluntary groups, and the Society for Proletarian Tourism set up tent camps and tourist bases to facilitate their touring. And so that became a kind of parallel site of leisure. At the same time, they needed to organize, or there was a demand for less rigorous touring. People didn't really want to go to a health spa for a month. They weren't sick. Many went even though they weren't sick, but there was this desire to travel, to spend one's vacation in another place, to encounter other people. So the tourist movement was developed to support that. And in the 1920s and 1930s, they were kind of independent of the government. And that Society for Proletarian Tourism, and then an organization called Soviet Tourist, set up these tourist bases and packaged tours, and you could sign up for a 15-day tour of the Caucasus, say, and you would take a train to Vladikavkaz and join your group there, and you would either hike through the Georgian Military Highway through the Caucasus and then down to the Black Sea, or you might take a bus or something like that. And that was a much more accessible form of vacation. You didn't, to get to a health spa, you had to have permission from the doctor and your trade union, and it was very restricted. And this was open to more people. Still, it seems that the majority of these kinds of tourists were not proletarians at all. They were maybe the Soviet middle class. Lots of school teachers did this, especially took these package tours, and developed a sense for an appreciation of seeing their native land and seeing the vast expanses of the native land, and getting away from their hometowns.
While you're just on this topic, I have one question. I noticed in the book that you kind of mentioned that there were organizational or institutional disagreements between health officials and union officials, say, on who should have access to certain vacations and why. And part of that had to do with the fact of, like, does somebody go to a sauna or a sanatorium in order to deal with an ailment, or is the access to the sanatorium part of a social welfare, or even kind of like a compensation package that the union would have control over? And that was very interesting to me, that you kind of outlined that in the early Soviet period, that there were these public disagreements between these institutions on, like, who would control and how they would be organized. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of institutional infighting for this is fascinating, and I think it's part of a deeper story of the Soviet political experience, that it's not monolithic, and there were interest groups and there were factions, each trying to do what they thought was best for their constituents. So in the beginning, the trade unions really didn't have anything to do with the health system. These health sanatoria and spas are run by the Ministry of the Commissariat of Public Health. But their clients were the workers who belonged to trade unions. So there was some kind of interface between that. So each factory had its own medical commission that was reported to the Commissariat for Public Health, and workers in the factory would go to the medical commission to get permission to go to a health spa, officially for medical need, if they'd had an operation, or if they had tuberculosis or some other disease, heart disease, that needed that kind of cure. Ideally, they would be sent to the right spa that treated their conditions. And there were always these directories of the health spas, and each one said what their special characteristics were. You know, we treat this and we treat that, and if you need the horse milk cure, you go to Central Asia. And rationally, everybody would be sent to the most appropriate place. But as I said before, people took advantage of this, and you know, there weren't really enough tuberculosis patients to fill the tuberculosis sanatoria, and they were filled by ordinary managers and foremen, just going for vacations. In part to acknowledge this, another parallel system was set up by the Commissariat of Public Health called homes. Or Dama, it could be translated as holiday homes, but these were kind of less expensive health facilities. They didn't have a complete medical regime that the visitors went through, but they emphasized fresh air, physical activity, and good food. So more workers were sent to these rest homes. Usually it was a 2-week vacation, a 2-week cure. Again, you had to have the permission of the doctor at your factory to go. You can just go to your trade union representative and say, I'd like a vacation in Vladimir, and could you set me up at the rest home? You had to demonstrate medical need. You were weighed at the beginning of your stay and weighed at the end of your stay. And if it was a successful stay, you'd gained weight by eating, 4 nutritious meals a day, and lying out in the sun and reading, and getting some exercise. The tourism operation began completely separately from this. It was the Society for Proletarian Tourism was a brainchild of the Komsomol in 1927. The organization Soviet Tourist was outside of the Komsomol, outside of the party. The trade unions didn't really get involved until the mid-1930s because these guys so badly messed up the business end of their operation that there was embezzlement, there was mismanagement. So this whole system of rest homes and of tourist facilities were at risk of falling apart. So in 1936, the trade unions took over both the function of the medical facilities and the tourist facilities. So then it became part of the function of trade unions, which, as I'm sure you know, were really a huge social welfare organization. They represented workers' interests. They defended their interests against the regime, against the economic organs, and they promoted these kind of health benefits, housing benefits, aspects of workers' lives. So from 36 on, all of this is happening within the trade union organization, which had its own department for health spas as well.
Diane, if we can go back a little bit to the sort of composition, because help me understand this. So trade unions were able to access vacations, tourism, because it was through the trade unions that vacations were organized. Factory workers, proletariat, miners, they're all through the trade unions. They're all accessing all of these vacation spots. So you said that only middle class had access to it, and then the proletariat was left out. I'm trying to understand, what do you mean by which proletariat was left out? Like who was actually, like, looking at, say, 100% of the people in different, categorize them, who's not taking a vacation, a year?
Okay, and this is who's in the trade union of coal miners. It's all the coal miners, but it's also the managers, and it's also the heads of the various mines, and the guys in the office, and the secretaries in the office, and the accountants in the office. And it turns out that it's the people in the office that were better able to manipulate the system to get these passes. Other trade unions, I mean, there's a trade union of medical workers, a trade union of teachers. So there are middle class trade unions as well. And they also had access to this system. So I see it more clearly in the 1950s and 60s from some of my conversations with people who experience this. So what happens in the 1950s and 60s, every year a book was published, Marshruti SSSR, so tourist itineraries for the Soviet Union. And each trade union office in a factory or an institute, scientific institute, would get this book, and workers in the institute would find the tour they wanted, and they would go to their trade union representative and say, could you please, apply for this tour on my behalf, because you get them free or discounted. So that's the mechanism by which the trade unions distribute access to these things. For health, it still had to have the medical stamp of the office, but it was still people who knew how to use the system that were more likely to take advantage of the healthcare.
So did everyone have vacations every year? Was there anyone so I understand what you're saying. So there's some people who are just better able to manipulate and be able to get maybe better rooms or something, or like a better, seaside resort, like Sochi instead of Batumi or something, right? Okay. But was there anyone left out actually from it? Because for my discussions here, nobody was left out. The debate is around more like who could have little bit better, so like the divisions between, being Sochi is considered like Sochi or Abkhazia is considered more elite. So, it's like having access to, say, Abkhazia and not another place being sort of the factor that's between the more managers or foremen versus more rank and file worker.
Yeah, I mean, those are really good questions, and it's there's some statistics at hand, but I think start with the fact that everybody is entitled to a vacation every year. And starting in the 60s, people actually got vacation, extra 13th month pay to kind of pay for that. There weren't enough of these places actually to accommodate everybody who was entitled to their vacation, even excluding the 50% of collective farm workers who weren't entitled to this. So if you're an average person, you've got your 2 weeks vacation coming up. You've got some choices. You could, in the 20s, it was mostly intended people would go back to their native villages and spend the 2 weeks with their family and drink fresh milk and get some fresh air. So it was only the really medically needy, acutely medically needy that would go to these vacation homes. Other people, for their 2 weeks, didn't want to go to any institutionalized place at all, just wanted to go off hiking on their own or fishing. And again, there's a gendered dimension here. It was much more men were likely to choose this for their vacation rather than to go to an organized rest home or sanatorium or a tourist base. So some people are just off on their own. Increasingly, in the 1950s and 1960s, because people wanted to take these vacations and there weren't spaces. And we can talk about the problem of the family vacation. These vacation facilities were never intended for families. They were intended for the medically needy, that the husband and wife had different medical needs and got their vacations from their factory at different times. So they never went to these places together. So if people wanted to actually have a holiday vacation together, they couldn't just buy a place in a Sochi sanitarium or a hotel. There were no hotels. So they went off on their own, usually to the south, to the Black Sea shore, and rented private rooms in the towns, in Sochi, in Yalta, in Koktebel, was very popular with intelligentsia. And these were called wild tourists, diki turisti, because they were not, they didn't have a voucher, they didn't have a booking. They just went to the town and scrounged for food and lived that way. They would have rather gotten a place in a sanatorium, but those are really scarce. So that's how the regime accommodated these. And it was really only in the 1970s that the regime realized that they shouldn't spend any more money on the sanatoria, which were highly labor intensive and expensive. And it's only then that they started building tourist hotels, which were, provided housing and food and some, recreational activities to expand the opportunity for more people to have these vacations. I think I cite some statistics in my book. In 1960, only 8% of all vacationers went to tourist facilities. The rest were going to health facilities, but there weren't a lot of them. So the facilities of both types expanded in the 60s and 70s, but the preponderance was these tourist places. So it's interesting that people remember that they always got to go to one of these resorts. Because I think that from my research, it maybe members of the intelligentsia could manage an organized vacation every year, but it was harder for shop assistants, cooks, waiters, and factory workers to actually manage this. My current research is on workers in the service industries, cooks, waiters, and shop assistants. And reading the minutes of their trade union meetings, they're constantly complaining that they don't get access to these places. We're just as good as anybody else, they say. So why is it that the worker at the automobile plant gets the voucher to the health spa and we don't get any? So I think there was clearly a scarcity of this, and the regime didn't make a big thing of this, but it's interesting that people remember that it was so accessible.
Also, like you said, that the propaganda videos show that there's like different kinds of people together, but that's also a lot of what a lot of people's experiences also say. Like it wasn't just propaganda. There were people from different fields that usually would never end up together, and not just professions, but different ethnic groups. So this was like the vacation time, these were kind of trade, cross trade union vacations organized by the state were, or the unions, were a time where people from all the different republics can meet each other, as like co-workers, and not and that kind of also helped their, the keeping sort of the cohesion, the Soviet identity as well, and having a place they can fall in love with each other, like even like inter-ethnic like relationships.
Right.
I mean, the military was one, and these vacations were another spot where they met each other.
Yeah, I mean that comes out particularly in the book by Don Raleigh, his interviews with the baby boomers, where every one of them remembers the vacations they took in the Soviet period, and many did meet life partners. This was a place to go to look for a partner if you're unmarried. There was that. There was this whole issue of the ethnic diversity and the national project of the Soviet Union. I didn't get into it in my book as much as I should have because it was so big and there were so many different aspects to it. The kind of the geography of tourism is quite striking. There was this huge, vast nature reserve that was the Soviet Union. They kept trying to get people to go to have vacations in the Urals and in the far north, but people wanted to come to the south. They wanted to come to the Caucasus. They wanted to come to Crimea, and they wanted the sea. A little of the Baltic Sea was a little bit, took some people away to those areas. So what you have is, coming to the south, people from all over, and these tourist trains, for example, they would come from Irkutsk, 3 day, 5 days on the road, spend 10 days in Sochi, and then go back to Irkutsk. So there was a way, as you say, for people to mix, and these spa towns, these meeting at meal times was you, because there were no family vacations, you were really on your own, and you did create these new kinds of friendships and new kinds of associations. The whole set of activities that were organized were also intended to kind of create this kind of sense of Sovietness. Every resort had a kind of a social director, it would be called in English, who organized games, quiz shows, how well do you know the Soviet Union? People would perform folk songs. So there was a lot of activity that was designed to reinforce this sense of Sovietness and to break down regional barriers and ethnic barriers. It also happened on cruise ships. There are cruise ships plying along the Black Sea coast with similar kinds of sets of activities as well. So there was a lot of this. The other part of meeting other people was there was an awful lot of extramarital romance going on and these vacations, because there were no family vacations. Husbands and wives sometimes happily took their vacations separately and had a little fling, and then went happily back to their partners back in the cities. This was harder to get at in terms of the sources, but everybody I talked to about these things said, "Oh yes, of course, that always happened," and was happening even 2006 when I was doing my research in Sochi. That people were still coming from the cities and having their little fling and going back.
Yes, this is actually one of the biggest nostalgia for Soviet Union in Georgia is the men missing having their sexual vacations. So yeah, it's a big source
Well,
here.
and this is why the regime, the officials didn't want to let families vacation together. They didn't want kids witnessing, as one guy said, things that they should not see. And inhibited the parents. They felt the kids were better off in pioneer camps where there'd be age-specific activities and they could create the sense of Sovietness for youth on their own terms. So there was this kind of a utilitarian sense that adults needed one kind of leisure and children needed another kind of leisure, and that, you know, cementing family bonds was less important than kind of cementing civic bonds or repairing health or something like that. So this, I think, was quite distinctive from vacationing in the West. And I don't know if that attitude or preferences continued in post-Soviet times.
That's actually what I wanted to ask. You touched upon this just now, is that you keep saying it was not family and not family oriented, but that's the beauty of the Soviet Union. They try to create other bonds that were not just a family centric, like a capitalist bourgeois state, right? That was the whole thing, was trying to create other kinds of identities and other kinds of bonds, you know, the way you can trust people, not just based on your bloodline, right? Like your immediate bloodline. Created cohorts in school, you know, like school excursions and cementing that class, literally classes in school class bonds. Same thing with bringing together different ethnic groups and during vacations, or, you know, like, so that to me is actually very positive, that they try to create different kinds of society that would not be only loyal to the family, which actually post-Soviet is the resurgence of family-oriented politics and sort of conservative politics alongside with it, you know, homophobic as well, and trying to restrict abortion rights and so on, and this sort of this kind of restoration of the capitalist family unit that's necessary to stabilize their, you know, productive sort of worker productivity and worker reproduction. So not being a family oriented, I just want to put that in context for people who are listening. It's not like they hated families. It was like they actually wanted to make sure there was all these other kinds of ways that people relate to each other, which I actually find incredibly revolutionary. And especially in this time and place, it's almost like, you know, like something I can't even imagine. It's like it's so foreign now, you know.
You could call this a kind of civic education, and in tourism, in capitalist countries, was also employed in service of state goals of patriotism. The national park system in the United States, you know, had an explicit ideology, was to make people proud of the wonders of the United States and the democracy that allowed these riches to be used for the people. I don't know if you ever visited a national park, but there was always, the ranger would give this talk, and it was always about the creation of the system. And that was part of what was underlying the system of vacation travel and tourism, and a very positive thing. I think another thing that really struck me, that seems somehow counterintuitive, was how much the ideology of tourism was meant to create autonomous individuals. It wasn't designed to create this kind of mindless patriotism, loyalty to the state, but the goal, you know, of the health tourism was to heal bodies, individual bodies, to make them better workers, but also to feel better about themselves. The goal of tourism was really to teach people how to be self-sufficient, autonomous individuals, and the tourist groups were supposed to be self-chosen. You'd form a group of 4 to 6 people of people with similar skills, so that you could all help each other out. And it was, you know, it was designed to test your mettle, to put, you know, go up against the elements, and you know, learn how to pitch a tent on a steep slope, or recover when your donkey with your food fell over into the ravine, and how to survive. And this kind of individualism, individual capability, autonomy, was really a really important part of this whole ethos of leisure, of culture, of all these kinds of things that the regime was trying to do, believing that people would freely choose to support this regime that provided these opportunities to be self-actualizing individuals. I think, you know, the memories that people have of having had the opportunity to go to these places confirms that was accomplished in a way that the regime sort of empowered people to take charge of their leisure time and time away from work. The family, there were actually conservative family politics in Soviet times as well. The anti-abortion movement, the pronatalism, the double shift for women, all these kinds of things we could talk about forever. But so I think the family was, you know, if some people thought it was going to wither away as a bourgeois institution, that quickly went out the door, not just because it was economically impossible, but it was emotionally impossible. But creating these various sets of bonds, as you said, your workplace collective, that was an important source of solidarity, and you know, workers together would go on cultural excursions and develop their sense of themselves to be able to be better workers. Mixing it up as you would in tourism was another way to kind of adjust and adapt, knowing you had these things in common. So yeah, I think that they were operating on all these levels.
Now that you've brought up this question of the Soviet individual, which I was also going to ask you about, it's quite fascinating. You know, another topic that I just wanted to briefly touch on was, you know, I'm always interested in the idea of the USSR as this form of modernity or socialist modernization, you know, like a developmentalist, industrializing and modernizing state that was able to, obviously, as we all know here, industrialize, develop industries, develop lives, develop a civilizational sense of itself that inspired, political movements and developmental estates elsewhere. So I'm curious, like, how would you imagine or see like the role of vacations in the development of Soviet modernity, but especially after World War II in the kind of like post-war period? Because, at some point in your book, you made this, you wrote this sentence that I liked, which was that there's something about the Soviet vacation that kind of transcends periods. And one of the reasons that you say that, which I thought was really interesting, was not only because it's kind of this memory that people have that it was such a positive thing, that regardless of when they were living in the USSR, that this was always a positive memory, but that you also have this part about this contradiction where in the late Soviet period, people are trying to articulate something about the Brezhnev era as being this period of stagnation, right? And a lot of historians now are kind of questioning whether or not it was stagnant, right? There was actually a moment of development. But you write about how like vacations totally expanded, became more accessible, infrastructure developed during this Brezhnev period of quote unquote stagnation. And so I thought that was like very interesting, that there was this kind of like connection between this like democratic access to the Soviet vacation as an expanding industry that was like centerpiece of this Soviet modernization process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. And I mean, there modernization for some meant just increasing the amount of pig iron that was produced and miles of rails laid and things like that. My approach to the history of the Soviet Union is to take the promises of socialism as making life better for people. I take them seriously. And I think that the key to this is consumption. You've got production on the one hand and consumption on the other. You need production in order to create a base for people to consume. And so the early stage of Soviet development was very much a production-oriented modernization, building steel mills, building chemical plants, teaching workers how to be disciplined in order to be efficient workers and all the rest. And people disagree about this, but I think that Khrushchev disagreed, but I think that the goal was to allow people to live better lives, to consume, and not just to produce. And this becomes really important after the war. The war kind of tested the resilience of the regime, and there was an expectation on the part of the people that now we're going to get our reward. We've been sacrificing, we've been building, we're going to recover, but what we want is to live these better lives. So what you have starting in the 50s is the expansion of housing, individual housing, not because the family unit was, the only way to imagine this, but this was people wanted to live in their own housing with a little bit of privacy. Housing was also very communal in the way it was organized. There were, the common spaces were organized together. Expansion of food consumption, and expansion of leisure, and expansion of goods to buy. All of this is part of this Soviet modernization. Khrushchev still, in the Malenkov-Khrushchev struggle, it seems to be Malenkov who was the big proponent of consumption, and Khrushchev was against. On the other hand, it was Khrushchev that introduced the planting of corn as a way to produce more meat that would put more meat on the table of the Soviet consumer. So for me, Soviet modernization, which really comes into its own in the 50s and 60s, is about expanding this consumer economy. And the officials, the trade union officials acknowledge this, the officials in the leisure sector acknowledges that people want to consume more leisure. And so I treat it as an item of consumption. It's a kind of cultural consumption in a way. You're consuming experiences and not just buying a good or buying a radio or a dress. And I think this also differentiates socialism maybe from capitalist societies. And it was not so much about things, but also about culture, becoming cultured, learning how to attend the opera, learning, as they did in these strange sanatoria, learning how to eat foods from different parts of the Soviet Union. So you'd get people from Central Russia who'd never eaten plov before, and they would try plov for the first time, or shashlik, or the kinds of spicy foods, which at first they stayed away from because it was so unfamiliar. So this is also learning how to be modern, is learning how to deal with this kind of difference and have these new experiences. And this was, there were differences of opinion about how to achieve this, but there was never any doubt that
we've actually had multiple people come on, debate this a little bit in different ways about if consumption is actually the goal. It's really interesting because nowadays there's such a anti-consumerism, right? There's such a huge movement for decades now against consumerism. Consumerism is sort of ruining people's mental health and driving alienation and so many things that is a criticism in modern Western capitalist society. And looking at it from 2024, perspective, seems that this drive, that constant just having more and more things to eat or drink or so on, is not exactly the key to mental health and mental health and a good life. What is a good life, right? There's lots of research out there, and number one is meaning to life, and it's having something, being part of a group and not feeling alienated, and so on and so on and so on. Consumption is kind of, besides basic, of course, basic food and so on and so on. Having that, of course, is important, but it's not the most important thing about having it. And so, in some ways, we had one of our speakers come saying that Soviet Union kind of saved the Soviet Union leadership, sort of accidentally, inadvertently saved from this mass consumption phenomena that's sort of plaguing the Western world because there was not that many goods. Their entire identity is not built upon the products they own. Because if you look at, everyone is really guilty of this. If you ask anyone, who they are, it's well, look around, look at my stuff. That's who I am. It's I'm a leftist, so I buy a Che Guevara shirt, and it's everything is buying and creating your identities, these products. It's interesting you keep saying you call travel and leisure consumption. Because if you look at it in Marxist terms, it's not really at least in a sense that leisure part of rejuvenating all of your bodily, how much you rejuvenate and you reinvigorate yourself from labor, is actually more in the production part, not so much in the consumption. And it's sort of what, determines like sort of value. It's like a social necessary labor time, like how much people need to have basic goods, but also like how much people need to rest and um, have time for themselves to then be able to exist as workers, right? And I think Soviet Union does a very generous version of what that means because it is not subject to the capitalist discipline that's always changing, because the amount of rejuvenation you need and the standards are constantly changing with the revolutionary capitalist process, and how much time you need to rest or how much food you need. Everything else is it's dependent on the context and the period. Can you discuss, because you talk about this in your book, and I've only read like a little bit, I haven't read the whole thing, but you discuss this idea of I really like the quote from Smashko. It's like the only place where workers rest is the graveyard. um, but this idea of needing to rejuvenate yourself and as part of not in labor, not just the labor that's controlled in the workflow, but labor means everything, right? Making for yourself or whatever, just existing through laboring continuously with the environment. So maybe discuss some of the ideas that were debated around that idea of like what is rest exactly.
This is, I think, a really important part of the early history of Soviet vacationing, because socialism rejects excess, it rejects waste. It was highly utilitarian. And you're right that initially, the purpose of vacations was medical, and it was designed to get workers back on the job. And there were even some medical theorists, public health theorists in the 30s who believed that once the Soviet Union kind of made work properly organized, there wouldn't need to be vacations at all, because the work would not be tiring and people wouldn't need the break from that. So in that sense, and I think you can think of consumption as kind of two ways. One is you consume things only that are useful for you. So you go on vacation because it's going to improve your health. You eat an apple because that's healthful for you. You buy a jacket because that keeps you warm. That's the only kind of consumption that is necessary, and everything else is superfluous and wasteful. The other kind of consumption which we associate with capitalism is people consume in order to distinguish themselves from others. So we think of goods that have use value, that are useful, or goods that have sign value, that they're indicating something about you. So you wear a Che Guevara t-shirt that says something about your politics, or you have in your apartment a glass cupboard full of books, which shows that you're an intellectual. And I think there was a debate throughout the history of the Soviet Union between the kind of ascetics who just said the bare minimum of stuff, and everything else that we produce is going to go towards culture, education, collective goods that are going to make life better for everybody. And others that said, no, people want to feel good about themselves. They like the opportunity to shop and to choose something, and not just because they need it, but because it makes them happy to have a new red shirt or something like that. I think the secret was always moderation. So throughout, I said that many people, Khrushchev even said people should have enough meat to eat, and that's part of consumption. The Soviet officials and theorists were always saying our consumption is good because it's in moderation. It's this wasteful capitalist consumption, keeping up with the Joneses, advertising, creating needs where there aren't needs. This is how we're different. but I think that tends to say that people didn't have any, they were going to be happy with one pair of shoes for their lives, but actually people wanted, a set of dancing shoes and a set of work shoes or something like that. So in that sense, I think, the variety, diversity, assortment was also acknowledged to be an entitlement of the Soviet people under socialism. It was a question of how much and how much waste. And the other thing, access, I mean, the distribution. So again, if you compare Soviet vacationing with imperial pre-revolutionary vacationing, it was only the very elite that had access to a vacation every year to go to these sanatoria. As unequal as it even was under the Soviet Union, there was still a much wider accessibility for these things. And now that's also true of consumption. So the goal of expanding the consumer sector in the Soviet Union is not to create more hierarchy, but to create more equality in a way, and not just have the nomenclature being able to buy a fur coat at GUM, but everybody should be able to buy a fur coat at GUM.
Yeah. So what do you think, sort of more of a bigger questions. So the goals, like you said, you judge or you have a starting base of the promises of socialism. Let's say the promise of socialism of rest and leisure, and how much, including all periods or maybe just, attempt changes, how much did the Soviet Union attempt or were able to meet some of the ideals of rest and leisure for the population of the Soviet Union?
The mantra is, we're providing more and more for the people, but their demands keep growing. So even though they quadrupled the availability of hotel spaces and rest home spaces by 1980, the population was becoming more discerning. They were increasingly learning how to travel, wanting to travel, and they wanted the opportunity to do it more. I think, if you think about foreign travel, which we haven't talked about, this was one of the things that was most eagerly sought after the fall of the Soviet Union. People wanted to travel abroad, and they were able to do that and come back. So I think that the facilities were expanded, but these Soviet institutions also enabled people to learn how to travel and learn, again, discovering themselves in the process of travel, in the process of encountering new places and new faces. So even though maybe more people did wild vacationing in their families, sometimes they went in family groups. So I heard one story about people, a whole group of people from Moscow would go to the south to be wild vacationers. They would all drive the same make of automobile, so that they would have spare parts, the same spare parts to fix them along the way. So that's a different kind of collective as well. It's a self-generated collective. And we know from all the memoirs and interviews that many more people were getting this opportunity. Even collective farmers by the 60s and 70s. There's a famous film, Love and Pigeons, where a collective farmer gets a pass to a health spa, and it opens his eyes to a new world as well. So I think the nostalgia for this opportunity is well founded because it was increasing. Another anecdote, when I was working on this in the Moscow archive, I was in the reading room of the archive, and this was a small reading room, and I said I was working on Soviet tourism, and everybody stopped doing whatever they were doing, started remembering the trips that they took. This was 2003, 2004, and also saying we can't do that anymore. We can't afford to travel. We can't travel to Ukraine, and it's a different country. We can't go to Yalta. It's easier to go to Turkey than to go to parts of the Soviet Union that we couldn't. So there was that sense of mobility and possibility that had become, if not experienced by everybody every year, it certainly was a possibility. And there was a sense that was lost.
we are a trade union. So people sometimes ask us if we can arrange travel still. And I'm like, no, like that's not, we don't have the kind of power or money. Doesn't like the other more traditional unions that are sort of left over have some ability to send some people, but even most of their stuff was taken, like their resorts and stuff. There are a few things left. But even the things they have left, they don't really give to their workers anymore. They make money. It's like businesses and stuff. But I was standing out last this 2023 May Day. We had, you know, we were like doing a May Day protest for a living wage outside of the Ministry of Health and Labor. And this older woman came up and she's like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Explain May Day." She's like, "There's May Day still?" And I was like, "Yeah, we're unions." And she said, "Please, please, can I please have a SAGs, you know, like these kind of like tickets to go vacation?" She's like, "I haven't had a vacation in 30 years. Could you please give me something? I just want a vacation before I die." And it was like the saddest thing, you know? And I feel horrible for, there's no way we can help her. But this was you know, the only time they had vacations. Like I would say most people didn't go to foreign travel. That's very, very elite that had the chance to go to Europe or anywhere else. Most people actually lost the ability to travel. So this idea that, you know, breakdown of Soviet Union gave access to the world is actually the opposite. I feel like it actually made people's worlds smaller. You know, a lot of people's worlds much smaller and much more restricted than actually gave them ability. Only the elites and people who were able to, you know, find ways and had money or connections were able to sort of capitalize on it. So yeah, it's like they can't go to different countries. They're also the safety part. Like my brother always talks about when he was a kid, he like took a tent and he would just go everywhere in the North Caucasus, totally safe, stay everywhere. People would let them tent in their backyard. He would just stay with people, and it was totally fine. He was like 14 and 13 doing this. Like it was this like sense of totally fine. You know, like nothing's gonna happen to you. Like it was a safety. And there was also, you know, not no borders and people could go everywhere. So yeah, there's definitely the wild traveling as well is very common. People just go to villages and just stay with families there, just anywhere. And people just take you in and give you their room. You know, it's not even, it's just so common. They don't even think about it. You know, they would never think of charging you or something. They would just be like, come stay with us. Or some people do rent out like rooms and so on, but it's like very acceptable in this way. So it's very tragic actually how much was lost that has not been able to be replaced in any other way, you know, like nothing better has been able to be built, at least as far as I can see, in 30 years. And so it's quite sad.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's interesting that that you described that the facilities in the Caucasus as falling apart and in ruin. Um, the other, I think, missed opportunity in Soviet tourism was they never really developed the whole country as destinations to go, and so there was this overcrowding in the one part of the country and less opportunity to go elsewhere. And obviously, capitalists have not opened up the Urals for adventure touring either. But there's kind of a sense of what the proper destination to go is. On the other hand, you know, I heard of my own friends that I met in Soviet times that you could just take your car anywhere and picnic anywhere and pitch your tent anywhere. And they would visit the United States and everything was fenced off and everything was private property. So there's real, again, that kind of accessibility, horizontality did exist despite the levels of corruption that led to kind of stratification as well. And I think here's where the role of memory, as opposed to what historians find out plays, is that I think in memory, compared to how highly unequal things are now, people are not remembering so much the corruption, the embezzlement, the black market, the blatnaya relations that everybody had to engage in order to cope in this society. But those are kind of two complementary. Memory and history are complement one another.
When I was growing up in the United States, one of my closest friends was from Kiev. And his parents immigrated to the United States right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, became good American citizens, and always tried to talk about how negative the USSR was to my friend when he was growing up. But what was interesting, that after living in the post-Soviet space, learning Russian, going back to visit where I'm from in Northern California, and then visiting my friend and his parents, we're sitting down and having dinner, and I'm saying, I'm living in Tbilisi, Georgia. And his mom's face like lights up, and she just goes on this beautiful speech about how much she loved Georgian wines, and how one of the best times of her life was taking a train to Tbilisi and Abkhazia and going on vacation there. And my friend, who I grew up with, who's my age, in his mid-30s, he was shocked, because it was the first time that he had heard his mother say something positive, and not just positive, but like from her soul, about the USSR. And what's been interesting is, like, in studying Georgia and Abkhazia specifically, and Sopo and I are always discussing this on the podcast and with others, is that, like, the importance of, say, Abkhazia as the Soviet Riviera, or the importance of Georgia as being a tourist destination. And of course, I remember in your book, even, you mentioned that, like, the treks on the Georgian military highway was one of the most popular tourist routes, people coming to Georgia. And so, in a sense, like, Georgia and Abkhazia, were able to stake out their place in this Soviet dream that you talk about as being kind of like the best essence of the USSR, the dreamed, like, embodied dream of, like, Soviet life, both in the sense of, like, access to certain goods, the way people are living, and the kind of the hospitality, all these different things. And so I think what's been very interesting to connect it to what we do about, and to what we talk about with the relation to Georgia, is that, like, Georgia also, like, assumed this very important role, no less Abkhazia itself, specifically in this kind of, like, Soviet dream, and the role of, like, tourism and vacation, and also Soviet multi-ethnic life, because it was not Russia, as, like, a centerpiece of kind of, like, what the Soviet Union was striving towards. And I think that, like, when we think about post-Soviet Georgia and the loss of, like, its Soviet life, a big part of that is the loss of this importance that it had in this Soviet dream that was being developed. And that, again, someone from Kiev, who was working as a chemist, the thing she remembers the most about the USSR was a place she wasn't even from. It was Georgia, and it was the wine and the trip there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a long history of Russian-Georgian relations that has developed this kind of Georgia as the exotic part of Russia, or the Russian Empire. Pushkin writes about it, and that there's the romance of the mountains and the wild mountain peoples, and it's kind of the exotic. It's sublime. The mountain landscape is stunning. The juxtaposition of the sea and the mountains. There's nothing like that in European Russia and Central Russia, which is really flat and boring. And so Georgia kind of exemplified the exotic other that's also ours. I think Eric Scott has written about this in his book on Georgia, familiar strangers. So it becomes this place where you can feel comfortable enough going, knowing you're going to find something new and exotic, new foliage, strange animals, different traditions. The kind of Georgian hospitality is one that is expected. I did a bunch of work which I never published on bicycle touring, and there are all these tourists who took cycle tours through the Caucasus. And every one of them, they'd sort of describe the mountain passes and the rough roads, and then opening up into the valley of Georgia and the abundance and the fruit and the greenery. It's a utopia, another world, but also because of that became so much part of this kind of Soviet imaginary that this is ours, and it's exotic place, and we can have this really intense emotional experience, aesthetic experience of seeing this variety. And that, I think, also reinforced the popularity of the Caucasus of Georgia, Abkhazia as a destination, precisely because of how strange and exotic, and also the food was good, right? I mean, the food is much better than if you think about shi and kasha, and people began to appreciate that as well.
Yeah, definitely. There was we had 2 Ukrainian guests this summer, and they were like, our dream, our whole life was to come to Georgia. So they were very, very happy to be here. But yeah, definitely Georgia is much more well off as well during the Soviet Union, and it is definitely a very privileged sort of place. That's why I think I would be interested in looking at a lot of the numbers of who got to travel in Georgia. I think it would be much higher than other places. So because of the proximity, and also because we were just a little bit more entitled, let's say.
Yeah. Well, apparently all the cooks on railroads, most of the cooks on railroads were Georgians. And so they would kind of do the food on trains. I visited Tbilisi in 1973, again for the same reason. I was doing my dissertation research in Moscow, and it was, you should visit some non-Russian part of the Soviet Union. So picked Georgia. So it was after Moscow, snow had already fallen in Georgia. It was fall, October. The leaves are beautiful. The kids would come up to us on the street. There was kids practicing their English. And, "Are you from New York?" I said, and it was so charming, and the architecture was so different. And we'd go to restaurants, and guys would send over wine to our table, and it was. So I kind of experienced, that kind of feeling of this strangeness of Georgia as well. So that's when I was doing this research for the book. I decided I was going to focus on the Caucasus and Sochi rather than Crimea or the Baltic as other tourist destinations. I couldn't do them all justice, so I wanted to do the archival work in Sochi, but partly because of that memory of that first trip.
შაქრის ყვავილი ბიჭი ვარ მოდი მაგ შარკის მოტოდენზე არა ბაკი ამ ანტენთა თევშევსაწვის ყოლებენზო კალკის გასწვი შენზე პატარა ვიყავი მაშინ გლების შვილ პირატბის ბავში ვაშლის ძივები მცესე გაში ჩემ იუნიკორნი თებს რომ გაში სკსაში რამდენ იარას წაში სპრაში ეს რომ ვეძებდი მაში ტაშიო იარე რამდენ კარში რამდენ ქარში რომელი ხარში სამყაროს სოდები რამდენი ხარში სარკიდან მიყურებს რომელი სახე